Nice to be back streaming. For whoever is watching this, either live, just tuning in, or watching it back on a video recording, it's really great. So basically, yesterday, I I resolved to myself that on Fridays I would just take a break, for a variety of reasons. It's not like I don't know. I think it would be very difficult for me to keep this up 7 days a week. I have to still find a way to be doing this while working on my other work too, to be honest. But also, I just feel like um, it's as important for me to be doing this on a stream as it is for me to be doing this while just doing other things that I think are interesting and fun too. It's, it's not, it's not a kind of differentiation in values like that. But so that's to say, yeah, I'm happy to be here. I resolved to myself that Fridays I would just do whatever I wanted on stream. I would still stream for a little bit, but I would just do what I wanted. And so, what I had planned and what I had talked about on the stream beforehand is that I would watch SpongeBob and just talk about it and share it with y'all. Because anyone who knows me in real life knows SpongeBob is like my favorite show, and really a piece of art, probably. But I just didn't really feel like it yesterday. I was feeling a little bit tired, and I didn't really feel like thinking like that in that way. So I just decided to stream a little bit of playing video games with my friend. And so, but I hope that maybe next Friday I'll be feeling up to it, or I'll watch a different cartoon or something, and just talk about it. But Fridays are supposed to be my kind of fun day anyway for the stream. So now I'm kind of back to the reading that I've been a part of. So that's that. For anyone who is watching for the first time, this is a stream where I just practice a slow reading practice as just a way of just listening, and also just a way of being with the person that that's a thinker that I'm reading, that's I'm with in struggle. So I really just want to be able to just be with them. So trying to read this sort of theory or thought from like people that are like considered thinkers, whatever that means, but they're also just people that are in our communities, right? In whatever capacity that we are in community with, so to speak. They're people that we should be being with, and they're trying to be with us, hopefully, by writing this sort of stuff. So I want to try to see if, well, I don't want to try. The way I like to read people like this. So, for example, I'm reading Edward Said right now. Next on the stream, I'm reading Denise Ferreira da Silva. She writes this book toward a global idea of race that I love. Then I'm reading another person, Horia Boutelja, who writes this book, Whites, Jews, and Us. And with each of these people, the way I like to read them is I like to just really get to know them, like as people. Like I like to be friends with them to the best of my ability. And what that means to me is just really learning how to care for them on their terms, really learning how to love them, really learning how to be with them, learning how they feel about shit, learning how they feel about the world, learning how they feel about their family, their community. Who are they writing for? Why do they decide to write? Because a lot of people have brilliant ideas and they're not writing books, right? So all of this stuff, I kind of just want to get to know. And I also want to get to know, in a case of a writer like Edward Said, I really want to get to know the writer outside of the discourse around the writer. Because I think that the discourse around the writer always has a sort of deteriorating effect in the direction of the world that the writer is so often targeted by, or so often displaced by, etc., etc., etc. So there's that, and I just really want to try. Like as I always say, I've been in different lives in my, I guess, life. Oh, that's nice. Somebody just mentioned me on Twitter. Thank you for doing that. So I've been in different areas in my life, and something I've seen that I feel is identical in my political education, political activism life, and in my academy, highbrow philosophy life, is the way that people approach reading and learning. And in any case, I find that, or in both cases, I find that the way people approach reading and learning is fundamentally capitalist and fundamentally carceral. And what I mean by that is people will read thinkers who they are supposed to be like caring about these people. Like you're supposed to, these are people, and I'll talk about that in a second, but they'll read them and their approach to reading will be, what can I gain from this? How can I use this? What is the product? How can it benefit me? Right? So what we sort of see is the text is treated as a resource to draw from, first of all, or the text is treated as something which is an external object which must be assimilated into yourself in another case, or the text is treated as something that's too big to contain, and then the impulse is to kind of contain it in summary or description, or to be able to master the text in some way. And so, yeah, I want to try to read as a practice that just has no goal in mind, no product in mind, as just a way of being with. And so that's what I'm doing. And I wanted to say one thing. Thank you so much for this shout out. I really appreciate it. It's really nice. And so I just wanted to say one more thing, which is like every day I'll start with sort of my reflections on on how my stream has been going since I previously streamed. And I just want to say that I've gotten this thing, okay, I'll say it this way. I've talked a few times on the stream before about how there's this sort of what Said is talking about in this book about a sort of engulfment of sort of threatening or difference of sort of threatening concepts or people, or of difference that seems threatening, etc., is sort of this process by which this thing called reality is created, right? And something I've been talking about a lot on this stream is that probably one of the best examples you can see of what he's talking about, in this really sort of deeply symbolic, kind of terrifying way. One of the best examples you can see of that when you're reading sort of thinkers is Edward Said himself. Because what you see is that he had this sort of reputation as a sort of the terrorist figure in the academy, both like literally called that, right? And maybe for good reason, and not saying good as in affirming their good, but like he was a member of the PLO while he was teaching at Columbia, actively involved in Palestinian resistance movements. And now he's considered such like a respectable, highbrow thinker. And the sort of respectability of him is built around this sort of image, which when you read him, it's night and day from what he's actually saying. So you see this sort of image of him that's been created that's a complete co-optation of him, and a result or an ongoing movement of a series of displacements away from him. So there's no really better place to see the implications of the things he's talking about than just to read him and be with him actually in this moment, and just to reflect on what that means. And I'm saying that to say a lot of I think it was intentional that I started with him for that reason, because I think it's an ethic that goes through a lot of different thinkers that I care about, but he is sort of one that's now old enough, so to speak, like this book was written maybe 50 years ago now, where you can see the critique of time and the critique of history and how it sort of does these things. These critiques which are coming out presently, and which new thinkers like Silva or like Boutelja, we're celebrating them for saying, but you can see the effect of it in retrospect on the reading. And so that's why I wanted to start with him for one, but I also get this sort of pushback kind of regularly. When I talk about Said, when I think about Said, when I do this sort of stuff, and the pushback is basically like the work that I'm doing is or the amount of attention that I spend on him is sort of this sort of I don't know how to say it. Maybe it's like reinscribing some sort of power dynamic because of his image, right? So it's like you're working on Edward Said. That's a boring project to me, or that's not a radical project to me, because Edward Said is this like distinguished Columbia professor. And so then you see, right, like how actually, because his racial position overdetermines the sort of ability he has to exist in this Orientalist world, actually the effect of sort of this identitarian trying to displace his privilege or whatever is actually to further remove anyone from engaging these ideas, which are deeply radical and deeply rooted in his existence as a Palestinian who experienced the Nakba, etc., etc. So you see, actually, the politic. If you have a politic like that, where you decide to inscribe value onto certain thinkers, and you just decide to reverse the value reverse the regime of value as some sort of radicality, right? Which is exactly what Said is talking about here. And I can even point to the line where he's talking about it. It's in the third qualification of this introduction where he says, one ought to never assume that the structure of Orientalism is nothing more than a structure of lies or myths, which, were the truth about them to be told, would simply blow away. And then later he says, after all, any system of ideas that can remain unchanged as teachable wisdom from the period of Ernst Renan until the present must be something more formidable than a mere collection of lies. And so what I read from this when I read this is, if you sort of understand that there's a hierarchy of value imposed across a border by a sort of European way of being or settlerness of being, and your response to that is to just sort of reverse that value across that border. What you've done now is you've actually maintained the border and the fact that there's a hierarchy of value, right? And so this politic is bullshit, basically. And it might be sort of a band-aid type politic where it might sort of work in the short term, but it doesn't actually process as unlearning anything. And so you can see this in the sort of case of a thinker which has been so deeply sort of engulfed into this this alternate conception of himself, like Said, where there's this like rampant sort of devaluation I've found in Western discourse, in Western sort of radical or left or Western sort of feminist or Western sort of anti-racist discourses, right? And Western Marxist discourses too. So I'm just listing all of these discourses that I can think of that would be signifiers of a sort of radicality, right? And you see the sort of devaluation of him in all of these spaces because he's this distinguished Western diasporan Columbia professor. And then you read him and you're like, damn, this dude is literally saying what you're saying, but 10 times better than you just said it about him wrongly. So if you read him, you could really, and his care is like really, really, really sort of wrapped into every single line and the movement from line to line. And I mean, just as the last thing I'll say about that, because I'm not really interested in being ranty, but the last thing I'll say about that is, I think it's obvious in another sense, because in any sort of space I've been in with a Nakba survivor, for example, that's, there's this sort of fetishistic, like sort of respect or awe of their sort of radicality for having gone through this event, which is another side of the same sort of thing, of the same sort of paradigm, right? But you see that Said is not actually given that. So part of this whole he's never thought of as a Nakba survivor or a Palestinian in the PLO writing in the West, like, or an infiltrator, right? He's never thought of as these things. But actually, when you read him, you see that he's actually practicing these things in a way that's fundamentally deeper than most of the people that we celebrate for practicing these things. And so you have to just, I don't know, it's always sort of for me, a practice of unlearning and reading against this regime of values that we're taught in order to decide which work is valuable, which work isn't valuable, etc. And it's a way of actually, I think the stakes of it are to be able to treat each other with a certain respect and to value each other in a way that's not dictated at all by the Orientalist society, so to speak, by the world, most of the time the Occident world, right? It's a way of actually valuing each other through an ethic that exceeds all of this sort of stuff. Yeah, that's all I'll say. I'm the first one to say that like old men in our communities often are on bullshit, but also I'm gonna try my best to be with them because I think we all make that decision in some way. That's all I'll say. But about that, and so I'm just, like, I have my own relationship with Said just like everyone else does, as a thinker, as a reader, as a whatever. And like, I feel that I'm getting a little bit tired of him because I've been spending so much time with him, like as I would with any of my friends probably who I spend so much time with. So I'm looking forward to sort of taking a little break in this capacity and when I finish this introduction and going to other things. But it's sort of not the same thing as the whole Edward Said alongside Heidegger and alongside whatever. Welcome to my chat, Ihabo. He says WebMD said reading is bad. That's hella funny to me. But actually, I'll say one more thing based on that. It's not really based on that, but for some reason, this comment reminded me of that. I actually forget what I was going to say now. But anyway. So let's keep going. I am basically here, and I'm gonna just like recapitulate what I've understood from this section so far. So for anyone just tuning in, hopefully the point of the stream is I'm reading slow enough and in a way that's sort of just reflective enough where you can tune it at any time. But so just because we're starting in the middle of a sort of section of a book, right? So I'm just going to talk about what he's been talking about so far. And so, what I understand from what we've read in this section of the introduction to Orientalism so far is that Said has been kind of, he says, I've been mentioning three aspects of my contemporary reality, um, which for him uh, point the way out of the methodological or perspectival difficulties I have been discussing. And so the first one that he's still talking about, and for me, what that means is like the difficulties I think he's been discussing are like how to even talk about this thing called Orientalism, which is the production of reality in itself, right? The production of a concept called reality. The things that we learn to not even think that we need to question. And it's not even a conscious learning process. Like the things that we just unconsciously just decide are true, right? There's a certain weight to those things which has allowed us to think that, as opposed to another thing that we hear and it immediately rings our alarms and we're like, that sounds like bullshit, right? But what Said is trying to say is if you follow the pattern of those things that have themselves carry enough weight that you can just like hear them and just believe them, then you'll see there's a certain pattern of racial violence that's happening there, right? And a certain pattern of production which he's calling Orientalism, right? And so that's what he's kind of seeing. So now in this last section, he's kind of saying, let me point some things about my life, which sort of point my way out of these difficulties I've been talking about. So the difficulty is basically how to talk about something like this. And the first aspect he talks about is a sort of phenomenon which he sees all around him, which is the distinction between pure and political knowledge. And what that has meant for him, in my conception of it, is, and if you're just tuning in, this is like a visual that I was drawing for fun, and I liked it, so I kept it up there. But what that means for him is what he basically has been discussing so far is that there's this sort of binary between something called knowledge and then some like objective truth or objective knowledge, and then something which is like political, which is like a contested subjective sort of knowledge or whatever, subjective idea, right? And what he's trying to say is all of it is political, all of it is ideology, but we do this thing where we always have to displace the idea of a pure objective truth onto something else. So even in a sort of like, so whether it's like these texts are objectively true, like science, for example, whereas these texts, like philosophy, are or whatever, like critical theory or whatever, I don't know, sociology, any of these fields, which they're not maybe the best examples, but whereas like these fields, like science, for example, are objectively true, these other fields, like, I don't know, like I just said, sociology, for example, are not objectively true, right? And so you can have this sort of way that you displace sort of the idea of an objective truth, which he's saying is a product, that process of thinking that is a product of Orientalism, right? You can displace it like that, or even in the best case, you can displace it onto the thinker themselves, right? So you can kind of really practice and believe the notion that every text is only really tied up in the historical moment and in the series of texts that it's been influenced from and all of this stuff, right? But it's very difficult even then to think that the author and their writing process is also tied up in all that stuff, right? So often what we'll do is we'll make the author the sort of pure source if the text isn't, right? And so that's kind of what he's been talking about right now in the book. And as we can see, like, and I'm just going to read the last line, so just to kind of catch us up, because I know it's been 2 days, so it's helpful for me too. And I just wanted to say one more thing before I read, which is that if I feel like kind of off today, it's just because I have a friend who I care about who had who one of their family members passed away, so it really kind of rocked me today. But the reason I'm saying that is I'm just gonna move on from it for now. But I'll post the link to the sort of GoFundMe type page that his family set up. It was for, and so if anyone has any, I know I don't have very many followers on here, but if anyone has anything to donate or you want to share it, I'm just gonna post the link right here. So okay, let me start now. So he says at the end of this part that we left off on before, yet there will always remain the perennial escape mechanism of saying that a literary scholar and a philosopher, for example, are trained in literature and philosophy respectively, not in politics or ideological analysis. In other words, the specialist argument can work quite effectively to block the larger and, in my opinion, the more intellectually serious perspective. And so we're going to keep going from there, but I also just wanted to kind of, as a way of moving forward from the discussion that we've talked about, I was returning to Saïd's previous book, Beginnings, this morning with a friend. I'm reading it very slowly with a friend, just like I do here. And for me, I've said it before on the stream, that book is not only one of my favorite books, not only by far my favorite thing that Saïd has written, but also one of my favorite pieces of writing ever. It just has like a certain energy about it that I think it's just unparalleled in really anything. I feel that way. I don't know if y'all feel this way. I feel that way about a lot of like like sort of early artistry from artists. Like generally I find that like I love the raw energy of an artist's really, really early work. And I don't know what it is about it, but it might be something that's tied into this sort of thing that we're talking about. I'm not sure. But like Saïd's early work is my favorite. Pretty much every artist, like even musical artists especially, their early work is my favorite. I don't know what it is, but I really love that book. I think it has an amazing energy. And so I was reading a part of it that I thought was like so directly related to this. So I just wanted to kind of read it here as a way of moving back into it because he's presenting the exact question and that he's talking about here, right? And I think the way he presents it here is accessible in a different way. So I just wanted to read it and then just go back to the text Orientalism. So this is in his previous book, Beginnings, in the second chapter, and he says he's talking about a similar problem, right? And he puts it again here. I am really circling around a very acute problem faced by any researcher whose primary evidence is textual. The problem can now be put in the following ways. To what extent is a text itself not something passively attributable as effect is to cause to a person? To what extent is a text so discontinuous a series of subtexts or pretexts or paratexts or surtext as to beggar the idea of an author as simple producer? If the text as unitary document is more properly judged as a trans-individual field of dispersion, and if, as Darwin, Marx, and Freud respectively read natural history, economic history, and psychological history as textual fields of dispersion, this field stands as the locus princeps of research, where does it begin if not in a creative or producing individuality? And then I'm just going to read the rest of this, and then I'm just going to talk about what I think about it for a second, and then I'll move back. The thing about this PDF, it's the only PDF of the book Beginnings that exists, and it's really bad. So I'll do my best to read it out loud. No one can doubt that there is an original in the vague, somewhat passive sense of that word, if not a beginning connection between text and individual author. Yet to readers, as even to a writing author, a text is not whole but distorted. For writing is not coterminous with nature, and therefore it deforms its subjects, life, liberty, happiness, more than it forms them. Reading and writing have this in common. They are particular distortions of general realities. There is violence in texts, which is answered by the reconstructions of the examining critic. I just really love that as a way of sort of putting this issue, because it's always the same issue over and over again of fixing a point at the beginning and then disavowing the origin of it, right? And so much of, I feel like what Saïd is saying here in this book, right, is that there's a sort of way we can talk about in two dimensions of making meaning out of anything, which is rooted in Orientalism. So we can talk about it in two dimensions as fixing a point at the beginning, like Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization or whatever, from which you build something out of it, the idea of a European way of being, right? So a European way of being, but you always having to, since that difference is only constituted by way of just elevating what you share with that beginning as your own identity and pushing off of everything that you have everything that's different. All it is really a process of continually reifying difference, right? And so what he's saying in this book, in a large sense, is you could, and he's saying it in two different ways. So I'm saying in two dimensions. He's saying there's a sort of point A that in order to create the impression of growth or progression or of livingness or of movement or of whatever for one's own identity, you have to fix at a previous point, right? And so that becomes a sort of point A, whereas you become the sort of point B, progressing out of that point A, right? And then in a three-dimensional way of saying the same thing, you can think about it very much as the sort of language that we have today of center and margin, center and periphery, right? So, for example, the idea of Europe forms as a center with the Orient as its periphery or as its margin, as the thing which is surrounding it but which defines it against itself, right? And so in the same sort of way, you'll see that the Orient is always, the idea of, or Europe, as an idea of a way of being, a European way of being is created, is always drawing from its margin, but also always pushing out against the margin, right? So always reifying itself against the center and reifying the Orient as its margin. So this is a three-dimensional way of kind of saying the same point A to point B thing. And so my point of that whole thing is when I read this sort of way of presenting the problem, what I sort of see is that what Saïd is saying is that this kind of way of thought, which is constitutive of a European way of being in his own words, or a settlerness of being in his own words less frequently, and my own words in a more contemporary sense. So this whole kind of way of thought, of thinking, not only defines a sort of way of approaching the Orient itself as an idea that Europe manages, but it also disperses itself into the way of making meaning and of learning and of experiencing the world in general. Where we always sort of need to sort of fix a point on the outside or in the beginning and push ourselves off from that point, or push whatever thing we want to give meaning off from that point, right? And so that's what I sort of see him saying here, right? Which is that this is a problem that's always continuing, right? Where we have to, even if, like, let's say we're thinking about Marxism, right? What we sort of do is we sort of fix Marx as the beginning of his sort of ideas, right? Even if we say that the ideas themselves are wrapped up in all this sort of stuff. And then we kind of disavow everything that influenced him around it. Or Freud, for example, in another sense, right? And so it's always this issue of needing to sort of maintain a marginality or a fixed point A, and to sort of disavow an origin. And that can happen even if you try to correct it from in your idea of how texts work. One of the deepest ways that sort of tendency, that way we make meaning in the world, is safeguarded, is by doing that with a person, with an artist, with an individual, with an idea of an individual. And I hope that makes sense. So that's kind of the way that I understand that. And so it's really a critique, right, of like the way that we literally make meaning out of things, the way that we manifest something called reality. It's a critique of something called reality. It's kind of a reminder that this thing that we call reality is always a product and being produced all the time. In another way of saying it, I think I said this like a long time ago in a very different way, and it was that what that makes me think of is like, at what point in our idea of like an ethical world or of an ethics have we decided that this thing is not realistic enough for us to expect? And I'm asking that because like I think about that a lot when I read stuff like this, because I'm like, reality is already a product of the power that we are trying to think outside of. So if you allow what's realistic to kind of seep into your dreams in any capacity, and they're always seeping into our dreams in a billion different terrains, right? So it's always a practice, right? But the more that we sort of allow or accept this what we see as the conditions of reality to influence our dreams or to define our dreams, we're really capitulating to the power that we're trying to dream outside of. So that's what I kind of think of when I think of the stakes of a text like this. And if you don't believe me, I'm not even extrapolating like on my own. Like Saïd literally says, which I had forgotten he said until I went back and read this. Saïd literally says on that previous page that we read, check this out. Or on two pages ago. Orientalism is not a mere political subject matter or field that is reflected passively by culture, scholarship, or institutions. Okay, so that's what we just talked about, right? Nor is it a large and diffuse collection of texts about the Orient. So it's not even about the Orient, right? Nor is it representative and expressive of some nefarious Western imperialist plot to hold down the Oriental world. So it's not even about Western intentions or Western actions, right? Or it's not even a description or a circumscription of Western intentions. It is a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic, sociological, historical, and philological texts. It is an elaboration not only of the basic geographical distinction, the world is made up of two unequal halves, Orient and Occident, but also a whole series of interests which, by such means as scholarly discovery, philological reconstruction, psychological analysis, landscape and sociological description, it not only creates but maintains. So basically, for me, like I've been saying, when Saïd is talking about a distribution of value across geographical distinction, and the way a geographical distinction becomes everything, basically, everything that we even have, every field of thought that we even have, what he's talking about is this sort of formation of a center periphery, point A fixed to point B, a sort of image of time unfolding, so to speak, to use his own term, that comes from the basic distinction between Orient and Occident. So, yeah, that's the stakes, I think, for me. And now I'm going to kind of return to this. So, okay. In other words, the specialist argument can work quite effectively to block the larger and, in my opinion, the more intellectually serious perspective. Here, it seems to me, there is a simple two-part answer to be given, at least so far as the study of imperialism and culture, or Orientalism, is concerned. I'm just moving on now to what we haven't read. In the first place, nearly every 19th century writer, and the same is true enough of writers in earlier periods, was extraordinarily well aware of the fact of empire. This is a subject not very well studied, but it will not take a modern Victorian specialist long to admit that liberal cultural heroes like John Stuart Mill, Arnold, Carlyle, Newman, Macaulay, Ruskin, George Eliot, and even Dickens had definite views on race and imperialism, which are quite easily to be found at work in their writing. So even a specialist must deal with the knowledge that Mill, for example, made it clear in On Liberty and Representative Government that his views there could not be applied to India. He was an India office functionary for a good deal of his life, after all, because the Indians were civilizationally, if not racially, inferior. The same kind of paradox is to be found in Marx, as I try to show in this book. Okay, so I'm just going to stop here for a second, because before we get into the Marx, I just want to talk about what I think about this, how I understand this, this sort of stuff. And I'm going to put on music too. I forgot to put on music, but let me just do that really quick. Let's see here. I love this song so much. So the way I understand this is, so basically he's saying, here it seems to me there's a simple two-part answer to be given. Okay, in the first place, you can't really deny that any of these sort of writers that you're talking about, that I'm talking about, right? Any of these sort of European writers, any European that kind of has sort of like been productive or inventive or been an artist in that culture, whether or not they spoke about race, that they had certain views on it. And then it becomes a sort of value judgment as to whether or not, as to how you think their sort of views on race bleed into or affect everything else that they think, right? I think that sort of argument, that sort of logical move, is always so visible, right? So, for example, like something I'll really often say is like people like I know like such a thing that just like gets on my nerves, to be honest. But something that I see so pervasive, right, in like I guess what will I say, anti-Zionist diaspora, right, is like a deep sort of belief in the possibility of change within the U.S. government. And so you can see this, which is blows my mind because the U.S. is a settler colony, just like Palestine is a settler colony. But you see this really lately. That's why I'm bringing this up. So like with like Ilhan Omar or Bernie Sanders more recently, or any of these sort of politicians. And my question is always, so all these people are outspoken Zionists. So like for me, when you're kind of supporting them, what that tells me is that you really don't see Zionism as a sort of fundamental aspect of someone's ideology. You see it as a sort of branch off of someone's ideology. You see it as just like you can be a Zionist and you can be other things that overdetermine that, right? So for me, it's like always it's sort of these sort of conversations always return to a distinction or a sort of delineation of how someone understands the structure or how someone models in their head the concepts that they identify with. So if you see sort of a racial schema modeling and informing our concepts themselves, then you would know that someone's views or someone's beliefs or someone's ideas or someone's orientation to race, right, is going to actually have a determining effect on every single little thing they do, even on the shit that they eat, right? Like every single little thing they do. Whether or not that effect is so determinate, where it totally is like, and this is what Said has been talking about in this book, right? You don't have to say that that effect is totally determinate, like that it's like the presiding factor, that whatever. But it always has a role in it. It's an aspect of their ideology, right? That always, and an aspect of their being that always has a role in it. Unless you want to sort of preserve this sort of neutral ground of whatever concept you're identifying with. So in the case of like Bernie Sanders, for example, and what I was talking about, people want to preserve this neutral ground of politics or of a human being. Those are the two concepts that I would think of, right? Where they want to say like, this person can still be a good person, but also be a Zionist. Or this person can still be a good politician, but also be a Zionist. And then you see that the sort of value that's assigned within this concept has to be made independent of that, right? So that's what I think of when I think of this sort of thing. But then he says, the same kind of paradox is to be found in Marx, as I try to show in this book. In the second place, to believe that politics in the form of imperialism bears upon the production of literature, scholarship, social theory, and historical writing is by no means equivalent to saying that culture is therefore a demeaned or denigrated thing. Quite the contrary. My whole point is to say that we can better understand the persistence and the durability of saturating hegemonic systems like culture when we realize that their internal constraints upon writers and thinkers were productive, not unilaterally inhibiting. Okay. Yeah, I really, really love that. And so I think the critique of Marx is kind of very latent throughout the book. And so Marx has been mentioned one time in the body of the book, I think. That's what I remember when I read it. So what I remember when I read this is 2 times Marx has been mentioned in the book. The first time is in this line where he's introducing Orientalism in his second definition, the most general one, or in the way I read that, the closest definition to what Orientalism is in itself, right? and he says, Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and most of the time the Occident. Thus, a very large mass of writers, I'm just going to skip this, have accepted the basic distinction between East and West as the starting point for elaborate theories, epics, novels, social descriptions, and political accounts concerning the Orient, its people, customs, mind, destiny, and so on. And then he says, this Orientalism, which is the Orientalism that is based upon this distinction made, right? The Orientalism which takes this basic geographical distinction as a starting point, right? So it basically takes the idea that there is this, as a starting point. This Orientalism can accommodate Aeschylus, Say, and Victor Hugo, Dante, and Karl Marx. And so for him, Marx becomes like the opposite pole of these like classical thinkers, right? Who are all kind of participating in this sort of way of making meaning, this sort of way of being, this sort of way of thinking called Orientalism, right? And in a sense, and then the other time that he mentions Marx is in his epigraph to the book, where he subtweets Marx as basically the first thing that is being said in the book after the acknowledgments, which is Marx saying they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. And so if you've been tuning into the streams, or if you want to check out the previous ones, if you're just tuning in, it's impossible to even begin to approach, but there's a critique of the concept of representation, which is so deeply embedded in this book, right? The whole book can be said in a really responsible sense to be a critique of the concept of representation, right? And the reason for that, even in the words that we've just been talking about, is he sees representation as a sort of delineation of the borders of what the thing is, always at the expense of the sort of thing on the outside of it that you can't possibly describe, right? So like basically any group of people, for example, is vastly too different to be able to describe as a unitary thing. And so that critique of representation is kind of so woven into this book. And then we have this line about Marx, and so then you can kind of see, I think, that's what that makes me think of when I come back here and I see that he's sort of basically adding Marx again. And then I can kind of see why, because this is the example that he's using, right? And he really wants to show this. And I think the stakes of that for me are him trying to think about, can we think about a world outside of capitalism, a world without capitalism, without reinscribing some of the fundamental ways of making meaning, ways of sort of thinking of thinking value that underwrite capitalism, right? And one of those means for him is representation. So that's what I kind of get when I see this. The same paradox is found in Marx, and that paradox being that there are people that are writing about freedom and egalitarianism, but on the other hand, fundamentally believing that certain races are inferior. So how do those two things reconcile, right? And how does that sort of fundamental belief wrap itself back into the scope of the work, which claims to represent everyone, including the people that it sees as uncivilized or racially inferior? Okay. In the second place, to believe that politics in the form of imperialism bears upon the production of literature, scholarship, social theory, and historical writing is by no means equivalent to saying that culture is therefore a demeaned or denigrated thing. Quite the contrary, my point is to say that we can better understand the persistence and the durability of saturating hegemonic systems like culture when we realize their internal constraints upon writers and thinkers were productive, not unilaterally inhibiting. And so this is a word that I feel like I've seen so many times in this book. When I see the word productive, I think of like, let's see. Continued investment made Orientalism as a system of knowledge about the Orient an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness, just as that same investment multiplied, indeed made truly productive, the statements proliferating out from Orientalism to the general culture. Right? There's so many times when Said is talking about a sort of productive capacity of Orientalism. And so when I read this, what I think about is how for Said, what he's really trying to say is, like, if you think of a structure as totally determinate, there's so many implications to that, right? So if you think of, and what I mean by structure is like, if you think of like a power structure, let's say like capitalism or something, as totally determinate of the realm of possibility, like that it predict of within it, right? Then what happens is you've actually universalized the scope of that power structure. In other words, for you, there's let's just say for you there's no outside of it, right? But then the question that remains, right, and so then you can see how this is sort of playing into what he's talking about here, right? The question that remains is, well, where did it come from? Who invented it? There had to be someone who invented it. And so is that person that invented it, were they God? Were they totally sort of independent of anything else? Or were they also sort of wrapped up in a whole world system, in a whole different series of beliefs, right? Outside of the thing that they invented, right? And so it's really a matter of like putting things in their place, even the models that we come up with to understand power, right? And a way of sort of doing that, what I understand from this word productive is a way of sort of doing that is to realize that it's not so much of a cause and effect relationship, right? Where like a power structure is the cause and we are the effect. Because what you've done then is you've like universalized the scope or made all powerful that sort of power structure. So what you have really done is you have given it the seat that it wants to have, that it claims to have. But if you remember that the representative claim that anything makes to people is not complete, it's impossible for it to be complete, then you kind of get this problem, right? And what he's saying about it is the way to sort of think outside of that is to understand that it's not so easy of a relationship, like a cause and effect. Like capitalism is the cause, we are the effect. We are also ourselves causes, and capitalism was the effect of someone inventing it, right? So it's this sort of way of being which sort of produces and reproduces this kind of system of what Said calls it at one point, a network of interests, right? A system of a sociality, a system of society, an Orientalist world, right? Which is always itself expanding and also limiting itself, right? So a sort of infinite settlerness. That's the way I understand this word productive. So basically, like, these systems of power also, people produce them and redefine them, and people keep reproducing them all the time. It's not so simple as it's just the system of power that's there and we are the effect of it. If we believe that, then there's, I mean, first of all, how are we even having this conversation? I mean, this is an obvious thing, but I don't even have to go into that, I think, but that's what I understand from this, and then I'll finish this paragraph. It is this idea that Gramsci certainly, and Foucault and Raymond Williams, in their very different ways, have been trying to illustrate. Even 1 or 2 pages by Williams on the uses of empire in the Long Revolution tell us more about 19th century cultural richness than many volumes of Hermetic textual analyses. So when I see him citing Gramsci and Foucault, this sort of makes sense to me because in this introduction so far, Gramsci and Foucault, 2 Western thinkers, are 2 thinkers that are kind of really prominent thinkers on power at the time and now still, that he is kind of turning in his own way in order to kind of talk about his example called Orientalism, right? So in section 1 of the introduction, he kind of says what he wants to say, and then is like this thing that Foucault is talking about as a sort of discourse, which I'm calling a field of knowledge, a field. He's calling a field called Orientalism. So he's basically saying Foucault's notion of a discourse is what I'm describing as the field called Orientalism, and he talks about that at length, right? And then in the second section, he's talking about this other thinker, Gramsci, and he's saying, for Gramsci, there's this distinction between a civil and political society in which the former is made up of voluntary affiliations like schools, families, unions, the latter of state institutions. And I'm trying to say that the thing that coheres all of these things together is Orientalism, right? And so in both ways, he's kind of turning these sort of thinkers, and so it makes sense to me that he would bring them back here to be like, it's this idea that Gramsci certainly and Foucault and Raymond Williams in their very different ways have been trying to illustrate. Raymond Williams, for me, is maybe a new... I haven't seen him talk about Raymond Williams yet. I guess a new sort of thinker, and the reason I guess he's putting him in here is because he's using him as an example in what follows. So I'm going to check out the footnote to see if there's anything interesting in there, basically. And no, it's just a 2-page citation from this book called The Long Revolution, page 66 to 67. But I'm gonna also look up the word hermetic because I just don't know what it means. So let me see. Complete and airtight. That makes sense to me. So it's this sort of binary that Said is really trying to wrestle with here, which it's a sort of, he says there's like thinkers in general who are thinking in a sort of European way of being, right, who are employing their methods in that, they're caught in this trap, right? And the trap is there's either a structure which is totally determinate on the individuals, or there's individuals which are totally determinate on the structure, right? So basically, and what Said is trying to say, and I'll actually read the line where he talks about that, right? Because I think it's really helpful. My two fears are distortion and inaccuracy, or rather the kind of inaccuracy produced by too dogmatic a generality or too positivistic a local focus. Difficulties that might force one in the first instance into writing a coarse polemic on so unacceptably general a level of description as not to be worth the effort, or in the second instance into writing so detailed and atomistic a series of analyses as to lose all track of the general lines of force in forming the field, giving it its special cogency, right? So in all these cases, it's this sort of like need to hold on to this sort of divine will. And what I mean by that is, by divine will, is like a will that is totally free and independent of any influences on it. And you either do it by extrapolating it into this idea of structure, which was obviously also created by a human being, or you do it by saying every human being has that, there's no such thing as a structure. And right now, I think, in like the way that sort of Western thought is, it's especially like Western radical or anti-racist or leftist thought, it's much more so about sort of giving a sort of divine will to an idea of structure. And that's sort of the way that you combat this sort of humanism, which says that each human is completely free will. But actually, what you've done is you've replicated the same sort of thing, right? And that was from a few lines when he was introducing this section that we're reading now. Okay, so let's move on. Therefore, I study Orientalism as a dynamic exchange between individual authors in the large political concerns shaped by three great empires, British, French, American, in whose intellectual and imaginative territory the writing was produced. What interests me most as a scholar is not the gross political verity, but the detail, as indeed what interests us in someone like Lane or Flaubert or Renan is not the, to him, indisputable truth that Occidentals are superior to Orientals, but the profoundly worked over and modulated evidence of his detailed work within the very wide space opened up by that truth. One need only remember that Lane's Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptian is a classic of historical and anthropological observation because of its style, its enormously intelligent and brilliant details, not because of its simple reflection of racial superiority, to understand what I am saying here. Okay, so let's take this paragraph piece by piece. So basically he's talking about what I understand is first he's talking about there's this sort of problem that I've been delineating, right? And he's saying, you know, you really can't deny that there is this sort of effect on these people that the writers themselves have sort of been influenced by the network of interest that they're part of, right? The social system that they're part of, the writings around them, right? And that they themselves then, because they've been influenced by it, if you accept that they've been influenced by it, then because they've been influenced by it, all these writers themselves are also reproducing it in some way, because that's just how it works, like in a very logical sense, I guess, right? Because you can't sort of be independent of the things that influence you. You can't be independent of all influences, right? It's just, or even begin to dictate how you've been influenced by certain things, by certain texts, right? By certain people. And so then he says, therefore, I study Orientalism as a dynamic exchange between individual authors and the large political concerns. So Orientalism is the exchange and the dynamic exchange, which for me, when I read dynamic exchange, what that means to me is like an always sort of changing terrain of exchanges between individual authors, so basically artists, creators, innovators, and the larger political concerns shaped by three great empires, British, French, American, in whose intellectual and imaginative territory the writing was produced. And so for me, when I see that, like the first thing I think of is like, so what he's doing is he's literally talking about how he studies, what his study of Orientalism in this book. He's not talking about what Orientalism is in itself. And I say that because, like at the end of the first section of the book, he introduces his sort of scope and his point and his stakes as, from the beginning of the 19th century until the end of World War II, France and Britain dominated the Orient and Orientalism. Since World War II, America has dominated the Orient and approaches it as France and Britain once did, right? So he kind of is sort of delineating his own project here as sort of saying like, if Orientalism is a sort of oscillating series of like approaches, settlement into the Orient, and then limitation, retracting from the Orient in order to cement its own difference, which is happening in infinite different levels of abstraction in infinite terrains at the same time. It's just a way of being. So it informs everything from the way that families interact with each other to the way that empires interact with the Orient to whatever, right? To the way that identities are formed, to the way that concepts are formed. But if you can sort of pinpoint the movement of this kind of broader level of it, which is in how Britain and France dominated the Orient from this period, then you could also maybe see what America is doing now and the pattern that will follow, right now being 1975. And so for him, it's like a very sort of comparative study between Britain and France in the period of overt colonialism and America in the period after 67, right? And so when I see that sort of triadic sort of focus, then my first thought is that Said is really speaking now on speaking now on how he's sort of defining his own study here in the book, and not on what Orientalism is in itself. And what he's saying about those is, I'm studying it as a sort of, not just as a sort of series of political doctrines, because I understand it as a sort of way of being that implicates everything. In fact, culture becomes the productive aspect of it, and the governmental side becomes the limiting aspect of it, right? So I'm not just sort of studying it in order to sort of get around this binary of structure versus of a pureness versus the political, whether it's pure structure versus political enactment, whether it's pure artists versus political structure. I'm getting around that sort of limitation. So remember, he's talking about the way he's getting around these sort of methodological difficulties, right? He's saying I'm getting around that in this book, in what follows, but understanding it as a sort of dynamic exchange between the two, right? They actually need each other all the time. It's not so much that it's just some exchange in space, right? But they actually need each other. There needs to be a productive aspect and a limiting aspect. In whose intellectual and imaginative territory the writing was produced. And so when I see intellectual and imaginative territory, what this word territory means to me is like what I would say, in other words, is like a concept or like a conceptual field or something. Whether that field is just called Orientalism, you could say that. But I mean, in another sense, he's synonymizing Orientalism with politics or Orientalism with history. Um, in each of those terms, you could say that it's reductive to say that he's synonymizing them, but you could also probably write a book on proving that he's synonymizing them. But it's these concepts that we identify through, right? And so that's what I think of when I see territory. And I see this word territory as a sort of ironic sort of dig at the way that, like, the settlerness of this sort of way of being, right? So the concept becomes territory in which you have to sort of stake your claim and defend it, right? Like, honestly, when I think about this, I think about it in like two aspects. I think about it like on the one hand of like I was like I was speaking with a friend a few days ago, and we were just talking about how this old department that I used to be in when I first entered the academy was like a very experimental department, and a lot of the fields in it were like very new fields or like just starting fields. And I had thought that when I would go in there, I would kind of find a lot of freedom to do what I want and do experimental thought and experimental work. But what I found was that the sort of and the reason I thought that, right, is because I thought since they're newer fields, since they're more experimental fields of thought, like then like for example film studies or like things like that that are more established, since these are more experimental fields, the borders won't be so firm, right? The boundaries of what I can do won't be so firm. It could be a freer space. But what I found is that the borders and the boundaries are not some sort of external product, but they're actually a way of being, right? So the people that were already in those fields were actually even harder, in some cases, doubling down on the borders of those fields. And the reason is because basically they're settlers, right? So what they want in their way of being, so what they want to do is they want to find new territory and lay their claim down in it. And so basically they want to be king of their own castle instead of being part of another castle, right? But it's always a desire to be a king of your own castle, so to speak. So that's sort of something that I think of when I think of this sort of way that he's using territory in this way. Yeah, that's something that I think of when I think of that. And it's an academic meaning of it, but that's what I think of. Okay. And I think it's a good example of just how, like, you can always accidentally naturalize or universalize settlerness and then attribute it to the texts and not to the people, right? So this is exactly what Said is talking about here. So I had attributed it to the texts or to the field itself, but I had sort of, in my head, I had made it so, like, people can be any way. They don't necessarily have to be that way. Okay. What interests me most as a scholar is not the gross political verity, but the detail, as indeed what interests us in someone like Lane or Flaubert or Renan is not the to him indisputable truth that Occidentals are superior to Orientals, but the profoundly worked over and modulated evidence of his detailed work within the very wide space opened up by that truth. And so my first questions are like, this sentence is a little bit hard for me. So my first questions are like, first of all, what do all these words mean? So I'm going to look them up. Let me just minimize this so I can go back and forth. What does verity mean? That's a question that I have. A true principle or belief, especially one of fundamental importance. So when I think of this, okay, so what interests me most as a scholar is not the gross political verity, but the detail. Okay, so let me just stop there. Let me turn down this music a little bit. So what I think of when I think about this first line, now that I'm thinking about it, what interests me most as a scholar is not the gross political verity, but the detail. What I think of that is like, one of my mentors used to always say, like, she really taught me this, like this thing which like changed my life and saved my life in like a lot of ways. And I didn't even realize it until like years later. I was not ready to hear it when she told me. But I was telling her all my ideas one day, years ago, and she was like, I'm not interested in a representational critique. And I was so shocked because what I was talking about was like, this shit is so racist or something. And what I learned later, what she meant by that is like, and the word representational can be really taken in the context of Saïd's critique here, right? What she meant by that is like, what is the point of just saying that something is racist? Who are you talking to? And what is your fundamental belief in it when that's the kicker for you? Like, that's the value of the thing you're saying, that you're proving that this thing is racist. Who are you trying to prove it to? Who are you talking to? And what's the point? Instead, what's more important, if you're really dedicated to art, to struggle, is what can that do for you? What can it show you? What can it teach you? How can you use that to sort of move in your own way, whether productively or whether cautiously or whatever, always productively. But how can you make it productive, so to speak? Because I think that so much of the way we just learn to talk and we learn to like interact with racist shit is just to be like, this is racist, and everyone's like, oh my god. And it's like that has currency in itself. And the whole implication is that there's a possibility for this field to not be racist. You know what I'm saying? And so what you've done is you've actually sort of like naturalized this thing called Orientalism. It always is going to be that way, but maybe we can make it not racist. And then you've already accepted that it's not inherently racist. Right? So anyway... So that's what I think of when I see what interests me most as a scholar is not the gross political verity, but the detail. As indeed what interests us in someone like Lane or Flaubert or Renan is not the, to him, indisputable truth that Occidentals are superior to Orientals. So basically what interests us is not the fact that he thinks that we're like this, because at some point we have to stop just being shocked over and over and over and over and over and over again for our whole lives that they think about us like this. At some point, we have to move on from our lives and just be with each other. And stop sort of giving them the benefit of, like, they just have infinite benefit of the doubt, basically. That's what that means. That every single time you're going to be shocked and hurt that they're racist. Every single time, over and over and over again. Because you just give them infinite transparency or infinite changeability, so to speak. I always say, I think I've said this on my stream before, but I always say it to everyone. My favorite tweet I have ever seen on Twitter is someone saying, and I've seen a lot of smart shit on Twitter, and I follow a lot of smart people. My favorite tweet by far I've ever seen is someone saying, racism is how many second chances you get. And I think that tweet is so brilliant, but you can see it. So what he's saying is like, we're not going to be caught in the trap where we're just infinitely giving these white people second chances over and 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 over again forever because they're white and they will, you know what I mean? That it's not even that we're not going to not do that either. We're just not invested in that sort of thinking in general, right? To be punitive or to be endlessly whatever, right? Non whatever. The point is what we can learn from it, right? What we can learn with it. So the point is not so much that there's this incident that they think this is an indisputable truth, but the profoundly worked over and modulated evidence of his detailed work within the very wide space opened up by that truth. And I'm just going to see what modulated means, basically. Exerting a modifying or controlling influence on. That's interesting. So what we really want to see then is how it has contributed to this field, right? How the sort of model that this work has set up has sort of reproduced in its own way the field. If we hold the model that, let's say, Lane's work here gives of like a European way of being, right? To what we think of as sort of a European way of being in itself, right? If we hold model to whatever, model to an idea of paradigm, an ingraspable idea of paradigm, so to speak, right? And I'm using that phrase because he uses it in his other book, and I'll return to it in a second. But if we hold this sort of model against what we're trying to pinpoint as this paradigm, which we can never really fully know, right? Then we can learn something from that, right? About possibly the movements of this paradigm, right? And that's what I take as the very wide space opened up by that truth. The very wide space opened up by that truth, for me, is the very wide space opened up by this, to him, indisputable truth that Occidentals are superior to Orientals. So basically, the very wide space opened up by that truth for him is like the production of a world, an Orientalist world. And this thing I'm saying about model and paradigm is from his previous book, and he has a really, really, really great like part where he talks about that I've gone back to a few times, but I'm gonna find it again for us now, so we can read it. Let me see where it is. If I can't find it in the next like 5 seconds, I'm gonna just go back to my book to find it. Okay, let me just go back to my book to find it really quick. Page 12. So in this previous book he wrote to Orientalism, Saïd says something really interesting. He's talking about this idea of intention, which for him is like, I think in a sense, very similar to a way of being. So, like, at some point in this book that I've read, I forget where, that we've read already in a previous stream, he says, like, Orientalism is an intention. An intention that informs all these methods of doing things. Right? And so he says, though, I do not mean, on the other hand, and then he says right here, an intention is a notion that includes everything that later develops out of it, no matter how eccentric the development or inconsistent the result. I do not mean, on the other hand, that intention is a more precise equivalent of totality, Rather, they are like the pair of terms model and paradigm, about as exactly grasped for practical literary use as a cloud. Right? So it's just it's this sort of practice, right, of knowing that you can never fully represent anything, right? Any concept that you create will be a limited understanding of the thing that you're representing, because things are just infinitely describable, right? And so the intention sort of presumes itself to be representative of the totality, right? Which is why the idea of the Orient, produced in Orientalist way of being, presumes itself and enforces itself as being the fully representative idea, right? Any sort of racial figuration that's a creation of a sort of Orientalist way of being, or a white way of being, European way of being, settlerness of being, presumes itself to be fully descriptive of everyone within that, right? But it's not, obviously. We're very different. In the same way, a model kind of presumes itself to be fully representative of the paradigm that it's referring to, but it's not. It can't be, right? And that's why we always have changing ideas of what it is. That's why, like, none of the ideas that we had 100 years ago about what these things were are really similar now, right? People are always changing them. And that's not just because there's some sort of progression where we're getting more and more correct, but it's because the paradigm itself is always changing. And the models are always changing too. So that's why I was using model in this when I was talking about this. But I really love this part so much, to be honest. Because I think there's a way in which all of this like circles back into itself so beautifully. And at every level, it's circling back into itself to teach you how to read itself. In a sense, what he's saying is so simple, it can be reduced to like a line. But in a sense, it's so complicated that it can be like thousands of books. And in fact, it is thousands of books in a sense, because so many people are saying the same thing in very different ways, but trying to get to the same sort of ethic, right? Which is that you have to get outside of, you have to never let yourself settle inside a concept. You have to never let yourself settle inside the sort of way of being that, or the sort of representative capacity that something claims for itself. You have to always basically be remembering God, basically. And none of these scholars will put it that way, but that's how I see it. You have to always be remembering that God is outside of all of this, actually. You have to always be remembering that there's something outside of this, and nothing is fully representative. Nothing is total. So it's the same sort of ethic that just keeps coming back over and over again. And so in a sense, it's so infinitely complex, but in a sense, it's really simple too. And so I really love how he does that, and how he's always so caringly trying to teach us how to read him, right? And trying to remind us over and over again. And what that tells me, as someone who's with him, is that his primary goal is for us to be able to unlearn some of these concepts and some of these ideas that were trapped inside. And I'm saying trapped very intentionally, because we cannot see a way out of it. He really wants to help us be free of these things, these that we've identified with, more than he wants to sort of progress his argument or wow us with his lines. And I mean, another aspect of that, right, is that this book is written for a popular press. It's written for Random House, right? It's not written with an academic press in mind, and that might speak to the relative like wideness and the breadth of readership of a book like Orientalism. It's Orientalism. It's one of the most monumental, so to speak, like academic, so to speak, books. But he didn't write it through a press like that. And so you can tell that he really feels the sort of responsibility as a teacher and as a thinker in our struggle, and especially because in like a very real sense, this whole book is about Philistine, and it's just really beautiful to me. Hey, what's up, Azam? Welcome, welcome, welcome. Nice to see you in the stream. I was just like gushing about why I love Saeed. That's all. Because I was just reading this book, reading this line, and I just really, really love it. And so we're about to just move on, though, into the next paragraph. One need only remember that Lane's Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians is a classic of historical and anthropological observation because of its style, its enormously intelligent and brilliant details, not because of its simple reflection of racial superiority. To understand what I am saying here. And actually, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this whole paragraph back and then go on. I don't know why I'm like losing that practice. I think like an interesting thing, if you've been following my stream, I don't know how closely folks have been following my stream or if folks have been watching it every day or what, but I'm just saying like I'm noticing certain things about myself. So like one of the things I'm noticing is that I'm getting less careful as I go, right? And that might be because I'm starting to feel like I've sort of picked up, or like it might be for a variety of reasons, either innocuous or not innocuous, right? And I'm saying that to say like it might be because I'm just starting to really get to know the way he thinks, if you're allowed to say that about someone. I think that to some degree we would kind of affirm that we know people better than other people, right? Like we know our friends or our loved ones. We know when they express something a certain way. They're expressing it because of this, right? But on the other hand, it might be because I'm feeling like I have sort of mastery over the text, or on another hand, it might be because I feel that I want to get somewhere, right? So I'm just saying, like I've noticed that I'm speeding through it faster, and I'm starting to drop some of my habits. Like for example, last time I forgot to talk about the reason why I do this at the beginning, and I was just ranting about the academy. And so you can kind of see the way that these things displace other things. But anyway, I'm going to read this paragraph back like I've been doing, and I'm going to move on from there. Therefore, I study Orientalism as a dynamic exchange between individual authors and the large political concerns shaped by the three great empires, British, French, American, in whose intellectual and imaginative territory the writing was produced. What interests me most as a scholar is not the gross political verity, I'm right here, but the detail, as indeed what interests us in someone like Lane or Flaubert or Renan, is not the, to him, indisputable truth that Occidentals are superior to Orientals, but the profoundly worked over and modulated evidence of his detailed work within the very wide space opened up by that truth. One need only remember that Lane's Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians is a classic of historical and anthropological observation because of its style, its enormously intelligent and brilliant details, not because of its simple reflection of racial superiority, to understand what I am saying here. The kind of political questions raised by Orientalism, then, are as follows. I'm right here now, right? What sort of intellectual, aesthetic, scholarly, and cultural energies went into the making of an imperialist tradition like the Orientalist one? How did philology, lexicography, history, biology, political and economic theory, novel writing, and lyric poetry come to the service of Orientalism's broadly imperialist view of the world? What changes, modulations, refinements, even revolutions take place within Orientalism? What is the meaning of originality, of continuity, of individuality in this context? How does Orientalism transmit or reproduce itself from one epoch to another? In fine, how can we treat the cultural historical phenomenon of Orientalism as a kind of willed human work, not of mere unconditioned ratiocination? In all its historical complexity, detail, and worth, without at the same time losing sight of the alliance between cultural work, political tendencies, the state, and the specific realities of domination. Governed by such concerns, a humanistic study can responsibly address itself to politics and culture, But this is not to say that such a study establishes a hard and fast rule about the relationship between knowledge and politics. My argument is that each humanistic investigation must formulate the nature of that connection in the specific context of the study, the subject matter, and its historical circumstances. Okay, so let's take that piece by piece. So basically what we see here, for me, when I read this, what I'm thinking, the first thing I'm thinking when I read something like this is, okay, this paragraph is hella important because this is Said laying out like the questions that are informing the book for him. Right? Like this is the point at the beginning of the book where he lays out all the questions that have been like sitting in his mind and circling around each other in order to even make him want to write something like this. So these are all the questions in some sort of relationship to each other. They're all circling around this thing that he's trying to study here. Right? So it's really important to understand this for me because we can really understand like the stakes, etc. Right? And so when I say we can really understand the stakes, the way that I have been reading so far, I've already been trying my hardest to feel out the stakes throughout. And so a lot of these things ring very familiar to me, but just like anything, like we're talking about with regard to model and paradigm, I have a sort of model that I'm making in my head, and I have of what the stakes are for him, what the meaning of the book is for him, why he's writing it, and that's fine. But at every moment, I can't allow myself to do this thing that he's talking about, right? To try to assimilate everything he says into the model that I have in my head. I always have to be willing to keep myself at a distance from the model that I have and allow him to correct me or to overturn everything I thought, right? And that's kind of just part of being with him for me. And I think there's a way in which we get a certain idea of what a book is saying in our head, and this is the tendency toward mastery that I was talking about when I introduced this stream, what I'm trying to get away from, right? I don't want to get into that zone where I'm just like, this is what the book is about, and every single thing proves that this is what the book is about. Because I could always be wrong. There's always more than that. I can never represent the book in that way. And that, to me, which is basically the imperative, like let's say in an academic setting of how to read a book, you have to read it like that actually, and you have to talk about it like that, and you have to present it like that, and whoever can make the best model of how the book is supposed to be is the expert on that book. And I will say that for me, what I'm learning from Said is that doing that, right, this is what he's talking about before, doing that, assimilating the whole text into a model of structure that you've made is just as violent of a way of reading as reading it without deriving any meaning from it at all. In other words, reading every single thing as not having any connection to each other, not linking any of the parts together at all. So it's just as bad of a reading then, in other words, of just extracting a quote out of context and using it. To insist that the context that you have decided upon is the only possible context, whether vocally or in the way that you're reading, is just as bad as insisting that the context doesn't matter. So that's to say that although I've been kind of thinking about the stakes throughout, and when I'm saying this stuff, I'm just trying to practice what I'm learning with him, right? So I really want to try to take this seriously in its own sort of sense, to just try to like be with him, I guess, despite that, right? And that, yeah, okay, so let me do that. The kind of political questions raised by Orientalism are as follows. 1. What sorts... I'll choose a different color today. How about pink? I'm going to choose a nicer pink. What other sorts of intellectual, aesthetic, scholarly, and cultural energies went into the making of an imperialist tradition like the Orientalist one? Okay. So let's think about that for a second. What is the other here? Like, that's my first question when I read this. What is the other? What other sorts of intellectual, aesthetic, scholarly, and cultural energies went into the making of an imperialist tradition like the Orientalist one? Does other, basically, so like my first thought about it when I'm reading it is like, does other refer to like quote unquote non-imperialist energies, or maybe non-orientalist energies, so to speak. So I have something written down on the side of this margin, which I just want to present because I don't know if I agree with it anymore. I think I've said before on the stream that almost everything that I'm saying here in this stream I've never thought of before with regard to this book. Not everything, but almost everything. And that's not to say that I don't have like notes in the margins of the book, but that actually every single time I read this book, I just gain a fundamentally different way of understanding it. And I find that to be true of any book. But so what I want to do now is I want to, because I'm kind of struggling with this, I want to just to model it, I think, just to practice with myself. I have something written down here. And I just want to kind of put it up and see if I really agree with this, though, because I have a reading of my old reading of it, and I don't know if I still agree with it. What I wrote next to it is Orientalist imperial tradition does not equal Orientalism. And then I have a line underneath. Oh no, that's for a different note. And so I'm thinking to myself, like, whoa, okay, so why would I have understood it that way before? What sort of intellectual, aesthetic, scholarly, and cultural energies went to the making of an imperialist tradition like the Orientalist one? And I guess what I was thinking before is that the tradition of Orientalism, which manifests itself as imperialism, is not everything that Orientalism is. Of course, because according to Saïd, in a sense. And so I think that the way I was reading this before, I was understanding Saïd as sort of, what I had done is I had sort of accepted the boundaries of imperialism as a definition or as a discourse that imperialism as a discourse gives to itself, like imperialism is this, right? But now that I'm reading it, I think that Saïd is actually saying that Orientalism is like an innately imperialist tradition of thought, like a way of being. I think actually it's not so mutually exclusive either. Like it could be both, I think. But I wouldn't probably write this way if I was taking a note today, which I am, and I'm talking. So this is my vocal notes. But I think, in a sense, like what I get from this sentence, what I get from this question, what he's trying to ask is, so I guess in a sense I see what I was saying before. What he's trying to ask really is, what are all of these sort of aspects of this way of being that in one sense manifests itself, that in one sense of it, and it's not to say a separate sense of it, but in one sense of it manifests itself as imperialism. So what's the scope of this sort of way of being called Orientalism? And when I say that, I'm like sort of reflecting to myself that the first, like after I said that, I was like, oh, well, the first chapter of the book is called The Scope of Orientalism. So maybe it's that. But who knows? Let me get back to where I was. Okay. How did philology, lexicography, history, biology, political and economic theory, novel writing, and lyric poetry come to the service of Orientalism's broadly imperialist view of the world? Okay, so when these two sentences are together, I'm seeing that he is really interested in how does Orientalism manifest itself into just everyday life? How does Orientalism manifest itself into the productive or creative aspects of a society into the progressive aspects of a society, just as it manifests itself into the limiting or governmental or political aspects of a society, to use a reduced definition of the word. So how does Orientalism, in other words, cohere a social system itself and not just manifest itself in the sort of overtly political, to use that term again, aspects? But in order to kind of just maybe understand it better, I'm just going to write this list out like I always do, and to see how it kind of plays out from there. And so he has this list where he says philology, lexicography, history, biology, political and economic theory, novel writing, and lyric poetry. It's very interesting because, so like, if we go back to the way that he previously sort of lists out these sort of fields of Orientalism, there's this one that I'm always stuck on where he kind of lists the missionary along with the scientist. And he says, the scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, or the soldier was in or thought about the Orient because he could be there. And so you see a sort of a line from scientist to soldier. And the way I had read that was that it was sort of progressing. They were linked to each other in terms of the sort of relative transparency with which they were representing their ideology. And what I mean by that is, like, the soldier is very obviously representing his ideology with his life, whereas the scientist does not purport does not at all purport to be representing an ideology. Rather, he purports to be representing the truth, right? Whereas the soldier is kind of will die in order to insist that his ideology is the truth, right? So it's like that. That's how I had read that. But then you see kind of scientist in the middle of this one, which is pretty interesting. But I want to look up what lexicography means because I don't know what it means. The practice of compiling dictionaries. Wow, interesting. That's very interesting. And so I can sort of now when I'm seeing that, I'm like, I can sort of see a movement from philology to history. Philology being like a sort of study of classic literature, right? Lexicography, a sort of practice of compiling dictionaries. History, practice of narrativizing or containing a certain, or writing a certain idea of society as an image of time unfolding. And so this is kind of really hard for me, I think. But when I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, so I can kind of see how these things sort of relate to each other. In that there's kind of movement, right, from a certain, like, and he's kind of listed out philology like this before. There's a sort of movement from like, what I felt before when I saw him talking about philology was that he was sort of seeing philology as a sort of exemplary of a sort of limiting tendency in like thought or in like cultural production. And what I mean by that is like a sort of way to like reintegrate and like reconcile like the contemporary with like the past. So like, and this might be like a fucked up view of philology too, because I'm not like that like I don't know that much about philology, so I could be betraying my ignorance, which I probably have done a lot here. But like, so for me, when I think of philology in the way that he's describing it here, what I think of is like, if you read like the Dark Enlightenment writers, how like the people that are like the ideologues of like Steve Bannon and shit, they're like deeply invested, right, in like reintegrating in like Roman classics, so to speak, and like Greek classics and like things like this, and trying to like reintegrate this society into that, right? So sort of like a deep investment in history, um, in a sense, right? But in a different sense than like a historian would be. Um, and so I can kind of see these as a sort of set in that sense, um, or as a sort of movement from a sort of relationship to history, where you are like you're sort of you're sort of integrating a history, whereas in another sense you're sort of assigning yourself a sort of descriptive aspect of it, and then you can kind of see where lexicography fits into there, right? Because you're sort of delineating or defining or redefining the scope of a language in that, right? And that's always like tied into an idea of history as well, and that's why we always have these things where like this new word has been entered into the language. You know what I mean? It's like these sort of markers of stability or continuity that you're always having to sort of reintegrate. Um, so really like a sort of creation of truth, or of an idea of truth, or of an idea of stability, or of an idea of identity. Um, yeah, which I think kind of for me like speaks to the role of us, sort of how he would be seeing biology in that, like, so this reminds me of like a line that I went back to, right, where the scientist is sort of like someone who's like safeguarding an ideology to the extent that it's not seen as an ideology, right? And so like one thing that all four of these have in common for me are that um, they're like, in the example of what Said is saying, they're categories of, or like fields of thought that are considered non-political, or maybe by a lot of people. And then you have this sort of move into political and economic theory, which is a category of thought that's seen as overtly political. And then you have novel writing and lyric poetry, which is for him like he's been using these things as examples of invention, or of creation, or of the productive aspect of this an Orientalist society, which reproduces new models in the way of Orientalism. And I think political and economic theory is doing that too, right? So you can sort of see a movement for me from like a sort of limiting function. Wasn't philology meant to reveal the essence of a culture through language literature? I believe you. That's really great. That's really, really interesting. So Asm in the chat says, wasn't philology meant to reveal the essence of a culture through language literature? Yeah, I was saying I don't know much about philology, but that makes a lot of sense to me, and that's so interesting because it's really, really helpful for me, because now I can sort of understand like there's a certain movement here in this question, right? From a sort of limiting, the way I'm reading it then, based on what I'm thinking about what you're saying, is there's sort of a movement from a sort of limiting relationship to an idea of one's own identity to a sort of productive relationship. And it moves from institutionality to a sort of cultural. And that speaks so much. If that's a way of reading it, that makes sense to me, because like he has just said, for example, right? What other sorts of intellectual, aesthetic, and cultural energies went into the making of an imperialist tradition like the Orientalist one? How do these come to the service of Orientalism's broadly imperialist view of the world, right? So in these questions, he's sort of talking about how like the questions he's interested in, which he calls political questions, right, are in how these sort of non-political aspects of a system, or of a network of interests, or of an Orientalist world, or of whatever, actually play their own equal part, so to speak, in the with the overtly political aspects, in order to produce basically Orientalism, right? To reproduce Orientalism. And so then you can sort of see the movement of this sort of like list thing in that direction, right? All the way from these sort of limiting functions that I would be studying, right? Like or I even am studying in other cases, right? Like, for example, would be studying historians, would be studying philologists, would be studying this sort of thing, which he sort of is, right? All the way to these novel writers and lyric poets, and etc. When I think about this, I think of, and I really appreciate your comment, Aslam, if that's not clear. Like, it's really, really interesting, and it really helps me because, and I really appreciate the way you're reading this, actually. Because when I think of that, when I think of what you're saying, that it's sort of meant to reveal the essence of a culture through language literature, what I reflect on is just like just thinking of Said like as someone who's just trained in like novels and lyric poetry and is just like sitting there being like this stuff is supposed to be like the freer sort of side of it, but it's like the same shit. And so then you can really start to see for me like sort of how this movement would manifest in his own feelings about shit. Because he's like, yeah, this is supposed to be the inventive aspect. This is supposed to be a place where their imaginations are free, and yet their imaginations are still reproducing the same thing. So yeah, that's really helpful. That's really helpful, Azam. Really happy to have you here in the chat. It's awesome. And then let's move on to the next question. What changes, modulations, refinements, even revolutions take place within Orientalism? I love that. I love the even revolutions. And so this for me is such an exciting question and like speaks so much to the kind of like energy that I've been feeling in this book, right? And sort of what he's been talking about the productiveness. So in this whole conversation that I was just like thinking out loud to myself about the model and how you can't ever think that a model is fully descriptive of a paradigm. Obviously, it's not true in a sense because our models are always changing, right? Like people that we were in struggle with our ancestors from like 150 years ago that were writing are writing very fundamentally different things in some senses. They're having different models, right? And the reason for that is not just because they're dumber and we're progressing toward more truth, but because the paradigm is always itself changing. So our models are always have to be changing too. If we're trying to model it in order to be able to understand how we're getting trapped in it. And so I love how he says changes, modulations, refinements, and then he says even revolutions. Because for me, revolutions is like this whole thing that he's been talking about this whole time about like, I've been calling it oscillations. But like, for example, at the end of the first section, when he's laying out the stakes of his work, and this part that I already read, like maybe an hour ago, right? Where he says, from the beginning of the 19th century until the end of World War II, France and Britain dominated the Orient and Orientalism. Since World War II, America has dominated the Orient and approaches it as France and Britain once did. And so for me, when I read that, and what I've been saying in every stream, is the way I see that is, he doesn't just see this as something that's changing. He sees this as something that is oscillating, or that is having its own sort of revolutions, right? But that the revolutions are just this sort of process by which it expands and then limits itself, expands and then limits itself. So it's an infinite sort of process of settlement, right? When I think of Philistine, I think of such a direct manifestation of Orientalism. And I can see why someone like Said would be able to have this sort of vision of Orientalism, even though Orientalism has been going on for forever. Maybe there's been other writers like Edward Said, who knows? But in point of fact, Edward Said's critique in this book became something that people felt like they hadn't seen before. And when I think about that, I can think of this sort of process of kind of infinite settlement and retraction and settlement and retraction in Philistine, and I'm thinking he can really see this sort of happening in his life. And so I really love the word revolutions, because you get to really see how this sort of thing is just, it's like a wheel just always turning. And when like the point in the wheel hits this side, we think it means something, like it's different, but it's just circling back and it's going to hit that side again. You know what I mean? Whatever manifestations or materials may result from that, whatever manifestations or material conditions result from that, are drastic and extremely important. You know, And that is sort of, I think, the balance that Said is talking about. So I love this word revolutions, and I think it's such a good word to have in here. And not only is it a good word to have in here, but the way he uses it as a qualifier for the rest of them, right? So it's not just changes, modulations, refinements. These changes, modulations, and refinements are revolutions. I think revolutions is a fundamentally different word because changes, or it's a different term in terms of its scope. Because changes, modulations, and refinements all refer to the movement of something or the reformation of something. But of course, reformation toward what? Away from what? So they all refer to the movement of something, but they don't refer to the directionality of the movement of something. You can change in any direction. You can be modulated in any direction. You could be refined in any direction. But a revolution is referring to a certain circumscription of the way that the movement happens already. So I really, really, really love that word a lot. What is the meaning of originality, of continuity, of individuality in this context? How does Orientalism transmit or reproduce itself from one epoch to another? Okay, and then so you can see, so what I'm basically thinking about, this is like really interesting to me because when I read this next line, I'm like, okay, so that really defines how I read this next line, right? Which is like, so okay, let me take it line by line though. When I see after that, what is the meaning of originality, of continuity, of individuality in this context? This reminds me so much, and I think it's such like a casual but like fundamental sort of retrospective on everything he's been talking about so far, right? Because he's been talking this section is the context of him presenting this problem of like the need for sort of originality or this concept of originality or this concept of continuity and how these concepts get us trapped in these sort of fundamentally fucked up ways of thinking, right? And the way that I had talked about that before was, and I'll talk about it now in the context of this word originality, for example, right? Is Said saying there's this need to hold on to an idea of a pure origin, and it happens. We have this sort of way of thinking where we either think that a structure cannot be changed by just individual actions, and then what happens is the structure itself has a pure origin because didn't a person invent that structure in the first place? Or we have this thing that a structure has no determination on pure action, so they're basically on people's actions. So basically, everyone's actions are inherently original, and then you have to think. Well, first of all, that's just factually not true. It's just not true. Like, it's basically an idea in which somebody becomes God, either way, right? Whether it's everybody is God, or the person who invented the structure is God, or in the case of the oppositional politic, the person who invented the critique of the structure is God, the person who invented the sort of way out of it, right? And so then you can start seeing why Said is kind of focusing on these figures like Freud and Marx, who have invented these sort of models, but for whom people sort of, because they're replicating the same sort of Orientalist way of thinking, are turning them into something in which they are sort of, it can never be as freeing in the way that they want it to be. So that's what I think of when I think of originality, and it's so cool to me to see how he sort of, in this series of questions, basically, has recapitulated all the problems he's laid out in this whole introduction and moved them all with each other. So he's replicated the sort of movement of the things that he has introduced in this section through just these really sort of fundamental questions underneath that he's never phrased like this before. What's the meaning of originality in the context of a system, of a way of being called Orientalism, where there's a hierarchy of value sort of distributed by way of separating off, of fixing a sort of point and separating off difference from that point in order to create an image of time unfolding? What's the meaning of originality when you've had to construct an origin? And it's not only what's the meaning of these things, but how does the meaning of these things sort of get caught up, or how do they even become sort of important issues for us, right? So I really love that sort of way of redefining everything he's been talking about. But then you see him circle back again. So that's why I just love this. Oh, I love this paragraph so much. He's just always circling back. He's always circling back, right? He's always reintegrating the thing that he had said before. And so then you see what really when I read this, I think of how I felt about his end of section 1 when he had said that like America approaches it as the Orient once did, right? America approaches the Orient as Britain and France once did. And so you see, even in the movement of this paragraph, transmit or reproduce itself from one epoch to another. Epoch for me means like a sort of like period of time, chapter in history, so to speak. This, to me, is referencing this word, revolutions, in the previous sentence. And so you not only see a sort of movement from question to question, you see a sort of reintegration and resyncretizing back in, alternating from question to question. It's such a beautiful movement of thought. So how did philology, lexicography, biology, political and economic theory, novel writing, lyric poetry, how did all of these modes of invention and of like claims to truth get caught up in Orientalism? What is the meaning of originality, of continuity, or of individuality in this context if any invention is caught up in Orientalism? What changes, modulations, refinements, even revolutions take place within Orientalism? How does Orientalism transmit or reproduce itself from one epoch to another? And so I love the way that it's just like there's such a movement and like a music between these sort of the movement of these sort of questions, which define the whole book and the whole stakes. But it's music in itself, which is really, really cool to me. And because then you could really see the stakes. The stakes are beyond the argument. There's a certain poetics in it. That's how I feel. But that's to say, what I learned from this question, after this question, is that Orientalism defines something called an epoch, like a historical epoch. And so it transmits itself, but also reproduces itself, and it looks different in each one. So like in another stream, this is why I was saying I felt that like the idea of like neo-Orientalism or something like that. Like this sort of phrase that we have in sort of, especially like diaspora thinking today is just so like pernicious and fucked up, and it's just like poor reading that's actually really fucking up the stakes of what Said is saying, right? Because what he's saying is this is all Orientalism, and it's reproducing itself in order to constitute a new time period, the impression of a new time period. It's not that there's this like all-powerful concept called history or time, and that Orientalism might be resurfacing in it. It's not the case. Orientalism defines even the possibility for that. And so, yeah, I really, 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 I love that. In fine, how can we treat the cultural, historical phenomenon of Orientalism as a kind of willed human work, not of mere unconditioned ratiocination in all its historical complexity, detail, and worth, without at the same time losing sight of the alliance between cultural work, political tendencies, the state, and the specific realities of domination? So I'm going to look up the word ratiocination. The process of exact thinking, reasoning. So let me just write this down. So again, I think what I read from this question is, and it's really cool. I feel like I'm really appreciative to be going through this slowly, because I'm really learning like how he's saying sort of all of this, and it seems like so massive, and it is, but in another sense what he's saying is kind of simple, and he's repeating it in different ways, right? And so you can think that the reason he's repeating it in different ways is because he really wants you to understand the scope of it, right? Like the massive scope of it. And so what I mean by that is, what's up, Zhush? I love the ghost. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome back to the chat. Azam's here too. We're all chilling. And so you can really see sort of, and something I'm learning in this paragraph is how much of Orientalism for Saïd is him trying to talk about the production aspect, right? The cultural aspect of this thing, right? And actually, what I also think is that when I'm reading it this time, this word work is intentional. And so he's kind of like, what if we're talking about a sort of subtweet of Marx kind of put in throughout this book, he's kind of saying, how is sort of Orientalism itself work, right? A sort of work, which actually is productive of something, right? And which humans do together in order to give themselves a meaning as a coherent body, right? Because for Marx, work is something that humans do together in order to sort of understand themselves as humans. And so you can kind of see how he's turning it, right? And he's saying, yeah, but that concept is not fully representative of all of us, right? And so then we have to think about Orientalism as itself a sort of work, right? And if we do that, then we can start thinking about like how actually it's not just some sort of doctrine imposed on people, but it's actually something people willingly do together and produce together. You can actually see it in its most potent sense in just cultural phenomenons, in artwork, in art, in invention. And like Azam said earlier, or was like affirming earlier, and added with this philology comment, then you really get to see like where Said is coming from as Edward Said in that, because his whole education is in like classic literature, right? Invention. And I really love this sort of understanding of him that I feel like I'm getting now. As someone who like goes through the Nakba, only a few years later enters the American Academy, and is sort of living in a world where he's exiled by his settlers and reading into the most cherished invention, the most cherished imaginative work coming out of the society of settlers, and realizing like not only is this shit not helping me in sort of understanding why they would do this thing in like a egalitarian sense, it is helping me in understanding why they do this thing in the ways that in this way, you know what I mean? It's helping me understand how actually their imagination is manifesting itself as my settlement. It's not so much that their imaginative aspects, the settlement is some political bureaucracy thing. And so you can really see the sort of importance of like cultural production for him as a sort of necessary, not only like that too is involved in this racist shit, but it's a necessary sort of in a necessary relationship with the limiting functions of these institutions. And that's why I think, there you go. So that's why he says, in all its historical complexity, detail, and worth, without at the same time losing sight of the alliance between this cultural work, political tendencies, the state, and the specific realities of domination. So how can we bring in the productive capacity of Orientalism, basically, but the productive capacity? How can we understand this thing as something that's actively producing and reproducing itself, as something that's actively producing this concept called reality, instead of the structure that's just imposed on us from above? If we do that now, what I'm thinking is the stakes of it are that we are unable to really focus on the way that these settler concepts and this settlerness is settling in us. We think that it's this external thing that's being imposed on us, and then we don't understand the ways that we have ourselves replicated it. And so then now when I'm thinking about this like this, I can really understand why he has led into this with a discussion of how these Marxist thinkers that he is in conversation with have this fundamental issue for him where they can't see themselves as implicated in it. I'm trying to find where that is. But there is no getting away from the fact that literary studies in general, and American Marxist theorists in particular, have avoided the effort of seriously bridging the gap between the superstructural and the base levels in textual historical scholarship. And on another occasion, I have gone so far as to say that the literary culture establishment as a whole has declared the serious study of imperialism and culture off limits. Right? And I actually misspoke when I talked about this on a previous stream, because I said that culture and imperialism was part of the trilogy of this, but it's actually a book that came later. The trilogy that Orientalism starts is Orientalism, the Question of Palestine, and Covering Islam. And I had said it was Orientalism, culture, and imperialism, and covering Islam. And then I woke up in the middle of the night I said the wrong thing. But then you could really get it, how he leads into why he's leading into this presentation of the questions that guide the book from this, right? Because then you can really see the stakes. He's always thinking of it from the stakes outward, right? The stakes of it are that if you're trying to critique power and you're not understanding it as productive and as settling in us, then what happens is you're modeling the freedom from it after yourself. And then you're not really... It's just I can say it in a billion different ways, but you really get to see the fucked upness of it in a billion different ways, right? And then you really get to see I don't use this term often, but deeply dumbass theorists like Ajaz Ahmed or something who write a critique that's literally this, right? And actually do a lot of work to silence Said in revolutionary circles, especially in Marxist circles. Even when I'm on Twitter, it'll be really often when I especially when I used to really engage in conversations like this, where I would post something from Said and someone would just post something from Ajaz Ahmed back, being don't read Said. And he's just a thinker who wrote a book after Orientalism, in which he had what's called the most heavy critique of the book or something. But it's basically just him saying this, him basically just cool card checking Said for not being Marxist enough. And Said is actually trying to say, no, I already know that I'm not actually enough of this stuff, but we're all not actually. We're all implicated in this stuff, so we should really not be posturing like that. Or else we run the risk of actually fundamentally compromising the ethical stakes of the thing that we're doing. It's not just about your identity is this, you haven't done this, you haven't said this. It's much deeper than that. There's ways, the ways that it gets in us are the ways that we have not actually thought about, by definition. So we have to really start yeah. I can just keep talking about it, but I think this is awesome. I have to say, I think this is awesome. Yeah, I think this is really cool. It's just a practice all the time, and you can see that because at every line, he's practicing it himself. At every line, he's practicing it himself and for us. And it's not a practice with an end. Just I'm trying to make... I think that's another way of thinking about how I'm trying to make this stream a practice without an end. It's not a practice with an end. It's just a practice because the terrains are infinite, and we, by definition, never know where to be catching it all the time. But the more that we're with each other, the more that we can sort of help each other, right? Yeah, doing each other's hair or something like that. Yeah, I think it's really nice. In fine, how can we treat the cultural historical phenomenon of Orientalism as a kind of a willed human work, not of mere unconditioned ratiocination, which meant process of reasoning. So not as some sort of process of reasoning which doesn't actually have any human effect on it, but actually as sort of cultural work tied up with all these other processes and realities of domination. Governed by such concerns, a humanistic study can responsibly address itself to politics and culture. And I think this word responsible is really important, right? Then. Okay, so what I get when I read the sentence is... yeah, so what I get when I read this sentence is... if you don't do this sort of shit, if you don't understand it as productive in this way, what happens is your critique or your study is a sort of critique of a political system without actually understanding how it's productive. So basically, you're asking to change the mode of representation with the implicit assumption that the mode of representation is like some sort of fully representative, dominating thing. And if you change the mode of representation, you will inherently change the culture of the people within it, which is just this subordinate sort of thing that's just, you know, always sort of in response to, or always sort of I guess in response to is fine, but in response to the politics, and never a mutual sort of responding. And so in other words, it's like, in another sense, I mean, and it's like funny because I'm getting to the point where you see the critics of Said actually saying this, but it's actually the opposite of what he's saying. And I don't mean to even throw this around like this, but it actually becomes a sort of liberal reformist politic if you don't understand the productive capacity of this sort of stuff, right? Because what you're asking is to basically change the government, and government in a very sort of expanded sense. You're asking to change the form of government. And yeah, and you're ignoring the fact that the culture actually has an equal sort of role to play in it, or a sort of push and pull type relationship with it. So it is really irresponsible. I really see that. But this is not to say that such a study establishes a hard and fast rule about the relationship between knowledge and politics. My argument is that each humanistic investigation must formulate the nature of that connection in the specific context of the study, the subject matter, and its historical circumstances. Okay, so the way I read this when I'm reading it is that now, just like he's done at the end of a lot of sections, for example, like, for example, where at the end of this first section, he actually sort of closed out the section here in the previous paragraph to the last one, and then in the last one, he like sort of ended it. And so what I had talked about at the end of this section when I streamed it was, what I liked about it is the argument ended here, but his pedagogy ended here. And what I meant by that is he really wrapped the whole argument in his always trying to teach us how to read him, right? And he sort of does that here too, right? So at every turn, he sacrifices the sort of like knockout blow of his argument, the sort of impact of his argument, in order to end it by reminding us that because he knows that this process of making meaning out of things is like so ingrained in us that every time he says something new, we're going to reconceptualize it like that. He ends this section by basically reminding us, even if you fuck with everything I'm saying, remember that my study it's this book, what I've said so far, is itself not the truth. What I'm doing in this book, what I've said right now, is just a model. But that model is never fully representative of the paradigm. Each study has to sort of do this in its own way. You can never just follow what I'm doing. And so he actually undermines the sort of prominent or like the sort of scope or breadth of his own argument at the end of him making it, as he's done many times, in order to kind of re-emphasize, like, don't get stuck in anything. Don't get stuck in me. And then I'll just, because I think it's a good place to end, but I haven't been streaming for that long. I've only been streaming for about 3 hours. So maybe I'll just introduce the first paragraph of the next section, and then I'll just call it a day, and we can start again from there. But, okay, so now we have the second one. So the first section, so just to reiterate, from what I understand, it helps me for my own reading. And I don't know if it's clear for folks who've been following the stream, but it gets kind of easier and easier for me as I try it again and again too. So at the end of section 2 of this introduction, he said, I'm going to sort of say some things about my general reality. I've tried to deal with 3 main aspects of my own contemporary reality that seem to me to point the way out of the difficulties I have been discussing. And the difficulties are to kind of like reconcile these notions of an all-powerful sort of individual or an all-powerful sort of system, right? The first one is, he says, the distinction between pure and political knowledge. So this distinction doesn't really exist, but that Orientalism kind of produces this thing called pure knowledge, or this thing called purity, all the time in the way we make meaning out of things. And I mean, the best example of that, which I haven't even talked about like this, is like, so what I've talked about a lot in the context of this map that I keep going back to, which I think is a great map to use because it's the map of the Muslim world according to Wikipedia, is that the way that Saïd is talking about how we make meaning out of concepts is there starts to become a way of being called a European way of being, which sees a center, which sees a sort of concept or itself or whatever, or any sort of entity that it takes as it identifies with as a center in relation to a margin which surrounds it, which it needs to sort of draw from, and whatever it draws from it, that part, to use Saïd's term, is represented as its identity. And the part that it can't draw from is pushed off from, right? And so there's this always sort of infinite settlement into the margin all the time. And I always come back to this because we think of things in terms of center and margin. Like, I'm grading my students' essays right now, and I know that I'm being fucked up because the only way that I know how to grade my students' essays is to be like, you have to have a sort of central argument. You know what I mean? Like, or else the essay isn't organized, or else the essay doesn't flow, or whatever. And it's an innocuous thing, but in my head, I know that the reinforcement of the need for a center is fucked up. But because it does this, is what Saïd is saying, right? And that anything like a concept will cohere by pulling the things that are similar to it into the center and representing them as the thing and drawing from this sort of margin, right? And the way that he also says that, as I've gone over, is you can think of it in a two-dimensional example as a sort of point A. Let's say Mesopotamia is the source of civilizations, which is fixed in place, or is the cradle of civilization or whatever, and is, in its difference, is sort of emphasized to create a sort of point B pushing off from it, right? But the reason I'm recapitulating that now is because... One sec. Is because what you can actually also see is that even that process of fixing this point A as a beginning is sort of making that beginning is sort of associating that beginning with a sort of idea of purity, right? Which itself also has to disavow all the influences on that beginning, right? Not to give too much away. But so, what you do then is you create this sort of doubleness where there's this point that's fixed at the beginning, in order to sort of understand yourself as the point differentiating off from that as a sort of forward-moving thing in time. But then, even to fix that as a beginning, you have to have disavowed all the things that influenced it in order to fix it as the beginning. And so there's this other sort of entity, not the point A necessarily, not even the margin, but this thing that's on the outside, right? That's already kind of understood on the outside. And so this is kind of how deep for me what Said is saying about the sort of idea of a need for sort of purity runs into the way that we make meaning out of things, the way that we conceptualize anything. And so he kind of, in section 1, deals with this sort of distinction by saying that we have to understand the sort of this thing as this way of being called orientalism as having a limiting capacity, but also having a productive capacity. And so you can really understand then how nothing is really pure in it, right? But it's actually itself creating this thing, right? Okay, and so then he moves on to section 2. Where is it? Let's see here. Okay. So that was the first thing that was the first point that he described as an aspect of his contemporary reality, which pointed the way out of the methodological problems he was talking about. Right? And the second one, that was called the distinction between pure and political knowledge, I think. Not to lose my place, I'm going to just highlight this. I'm just going to make sure, though. The distinction between pure and political knowledge, yeah. And then there's the second one, now that he calls... Bro, where the fuck did this go? The methodological question. In a previous book, the one that I've been referencing a lot, right, I gave a good deal of thought and analysis to the methodological importance for work in the human sciences of finding and formulating a first step, a point of departure, a beginning principle. I'm just going to go back and see if he says anything in the footnote about that. No, he just said, in my beginnings, intention, and method. One of my most well-worn books, as you can see. Okay, but then you can really start to see, like, even in the stakes of what he's talking about, how much this book builds out of that one, right? Anyway, but I won't go into that. That's a whole separate thing. Which maybe in my stream in 2 months you'll find me being like, I wrote about this, here's the link or something. But I will say one thing on stream for in the spirit of just sharing all my ideas about all this shit, which is that what you see, so if you go back, this is just for folks who are interested in what I'm saying. If you go back into like saïd studies, which is like a giant ass field of knowledge now, right? Where they're trying to summarize and represent who Said was as a person, to find a way that they can find a saïd without contradictions that compromise, basically all the shit that he's talking about as a problem, they're doing for him. All the shit that he's talking about how a field forms, they're doing this to him as a person, right? But you'll see actually something very interesting, a very interesting phenomenon right in the alley. And that's why I was saying at the beginning of the stream that the best possible example to see what Said is talking about is to watch what has happened to him as a person in the 50 years since he published this book, right? So what you'll see actually, which is very interesting to me, is that there is not one study you can find which links what he said in his previous book to this book, Orientalism. Not one. And it's really, really interesting because, look, it's all over it, right? Like, in my impression, it's all over it. If you've been following my stream, you've been seeing me go back and forth to this book because a lot of the fundamental concepts he uses are concepts straight from his previous book. Of course, any thinker is going to be developing from book to book, right? But what happened basically is, because Orientalism is such a massive sort of book, a sort of massive sort of shift in like whatever, it was a massive phenomenon or whatever, right? But the way that meaning is made out of Orientalism being a massive phenomenon, the way that that manifests, right, is that it becomes a sort of beginning point in time, right? It becomes a sort of fixed at the margin point where the discourse starts drawing from it into a sort of center, right? But also disavowing things about the book that it doesn't like. Or, in other words, it becomes a sort of point A from which everything else is point B, right? Orientalism is sort of the start of talking about Orientalism in the way that it has sort of like its idea has sort of, or its memory has sort of deteriorated and corroded throughout history. But so then you could see that in a very kind of crazy fucking obvious example, because there's nobody in the 50 years since writing about this famous ass book has ever thought to connect the previous book to it. And that's because in the way that this book gets meaning even, it has to be the fixed starting point from which everything else before that is disavowed. So it's so fucking interesting. Like, you can really just see the exact process of making meaning that he's talking about happening to him and to his book all the time. And notwithstanding that it's a book about Orientalism, so of course it's going to draw that sort of discourse like a billion times as much, right? But then when you read something like this, that where in the introduction he's talking about like the shit that I'm studying is straight from my previous book, and you see that nobody has actually made this connection, you see the strength of this sort of way of making meaning that he's talking about. He's been trying to correct us from it at every single point, and yet there is not even an inkling in the Western discourse around the book, in the fields that have developed around the book, around him, around studies of Orientalism, of having learned that lesson. Not even an inkling of having heard that. And you can see it at every sort of level, right? And so that's why I'm saying, like, when I see this, that he's referencing this previous book, I just wanted to share that as such an interesting example of the weight and of the seriousness of the breadth of the issue, of the problem that he's talking about. It actually fundamentally distorts our idea of reality. Or, in other words, our idea of reality is fundamentally a distortion. For example, the reality of what we think about Orientalism is fundamentally distorted in this way because any sort of way that the idea of what Orientalism is or what he's saying in this book has carried has cut it off from the previous book where this is really like a sort of part 2 to that study in his own words. So even on that example, it's like very clearly just straight up a complete distortion. And it's the thing that we just know as the reality of what Orientalism is. Until we really sit down and value him and try to be with him and realize, oh shit, there's a whole world outside of this. Right? Thanks, Azam. I think it's really interesting too. I was like, I wonder what they're all thinking. I'm just going in right now. But no, for real. Like, it's so interesting. It's so interesting. And it's so fucked up. It's like so deeply fucked up. Right? Like, I can't even begin to like approach how fucked up it is. But yeah. And so, yeah, the only way that you really get to know how fucked up that is by just being with him and listening to him and really trying to listen to him and be with him in a way that is sort of outside of the whole discourse. And then you just learn there's a whole world outside of this. And I'm going to say one more thing about that, which is if you have been listening to what I'm saying to my 4 viewers right now, including me, if you've been listening to what I'm saying and you have been taking from it that the fucked up thing is that the reality has been distorted, that's again a product of the thing he's talking about. Because what he's trying to say is this thing called reality is itself a distortion. It's not a matter of like if you think about it like that, like the fucked upness of it is that the reality is non-representative of him, then you see that you've replicated the same sort of thinking even there, right? Where you want to sort of bring the correct reading of Saïd into the center, right? But even that notion of a correct reading of Saïd bringing it into the center will displace something else. There's no such thing. That's the point. And so actually, maybe for me, when I think about something like this, I don't even think I don't want to. So, and then I'll just take you through the process, right? Then the second way of thinking about it, right, is to be like, to sort of valorize the fact that it's not being talked about, right? To sort of valorize that and to be like, there's a certain like freedom that the true saïd has outside of this space of discourse, right? But then, if you think about it like that, what you've done is you have replicated this thing that Said was talking about in his second qualification on his introduction to Orientalism, right? Or his third qualification, where he says, one ought to never assume that the structure of Orientalism is nothing more than a structure of lies or myths, which, were the truth about them to be told, would simply blow away. And then later he says, after all, any system of ideas that can remain unchanged as teachable wisdom from the period of Renan in the late 1840s until the present in the United States must be something more formidable than a mere collection of lies. And so what he's basically saying there, right, is there's this oppositional kind of mode of thinking where you sort of just reverse it, right? Where you're like, as opposed to the thing in the center being valorized, now the thing on the margin is being valorized, right? And you've still sort of capitulated to that border that is distributing value across, and you've just reversed the value. So that's how my mind goes. The first way my mind goes when I read something like this is, I need to tell everyone about this so I can bring it into the center. And I'm like, that's fucked up. And the second way my mind goes is like, actually, it's a good thing that it's not in the center, because whatever. And the center is where all the bad shit is. That's fucked up too. Right? That's fucked up too, actually. It's actually replicating the same thing. And so then you kind of have to be able to think of it in a way that's like just totally outside of that regime of value in general, which is that like literally all of this shit is fucked up. Like just it's not only that, but you have to sort of approach it with an ethic that's totally independent of center and margin. You have to approach it with an ethic that's just like, for me, that's how I come to terms with it. And maybe we can feel different. But for me, the way I come to terms with it is like, you have to approach it with an ethic of like, I want to try to be with everyone in the center or the margin as much as I can in a way that's independent of this sort of thing. So I want to try to be with the saïd in the center. I want to try to be with saïd in the margin, because there is a saïd that's sort of brought into the center too, right? I want to just try to be with saïd independent of how he's marginalized or centered, so to speak. That's a better way of saying it than I want to be with him in the center and in the thing. And you can't really do it, but it's a practice. And maybe actually what I'm presenting is a really fundamental sort of issue, right? It's the whole stakes and the whole ethics of the whole thing. So it's where I'm at in trying to think about it right now. But the way that I think about it right now is that it's just a matter of really being with him. And the center margin conversation, that shit's gonna go on. Like, it's just gonna go on. And yeah. So that's how I kind of see it. But yeah, it's really interesting stuff. Really, really interesting stuff. Where is this? Being with says so much. Yeah. Because are you really like... Yeah. Yeah. We can see... Okay, so actually that really helps me, Azem. Thank you. And I think that really helps me say what I'm trying to say. So Azem says, being with says so much. And for me, it's like, the process of Orientalism is that there is a part of Saïd that is represented in the center. And there is a part of Saïd that is pushed out. Right? And so what I meant by being with the Saïd in the center and being with Saïd in the margin is, if I just wanted to kind of be with the Saïd at the margin, I'm also sort of disavowing that part in Saïd's words which are represented as a part of a European, Columbia-educated academic elite. That part is also him. So how could I be with him with his contradictions? How could I fully be with him or try to fully be with him? And that, for me, is an ethic that sort of transcends the whole center margin paradigm, um, in the way that Saïd is teaching me here. So, yeah. And actually, just on that note, because I think it's interesting and important, I'll just, like, share this Glissant quote that I really love about that. Because I've been reading this book by Edouard Glissant called Poetics of Relation, and he literally talks about that. So he talks about this as sort of stages in the way that I had talked about, like, and I'm realizing now, the way that I had talked about the first two stages of the way that I thought about it, this is sort of a way that Glissant also talks about it. And then he says, in a third stage, the trajectory is abolished. The arrow-like projection becomes curved. The poet's word leads from periphery to periphery, and yes, it reproduces the track of circular nomadism. That is, it makes every periphery into a center. Furthermore, it abolishes the very notion of center and periphery. I love that. Anyway, the methodological question. In a previous book, I gave a good deal of thought and analysis to the methodological importance for work in the human sciences of finding and formulating a first step, a point of departure, a beginning principle. Which, as I said, you can just tell is literally what he's doing in this book too, right? A major lesson I learned and tried to present was that there is no such thing as a merely given or simply available starting point. Beginnings have to be made for each project, such as Orientalism, in such a way as to enable what follows from them. Nowhere in my experience has the difficulty of this lesson been more consciously lived, with what success or failure I cannot really say, than in the study of Orientalism. It's almost like prophetic when you read it. You're like, damn, because 50 years later, you're like, damn, when he says, or success or failure I cannot really say. And then 50 years later, you're like, how do I even measure that? How would I even say if it was a success or failure? Of years. Because you can really tell that he was trying his fucking hardest. And the stakes of it for me are like this feeling that I have, like when I just go through the world, that like my body overdetermines my words no matter what I do. So yeah. How do you even measure that? And like, what does it mean to even feel enough to say something like this in the introduction to your book? It's crazy. Nowhere in my experience has the difficulty of this, and he knows this, right? Because he's Edward Saïd, Columbia professor, trained in their own way of thinking. He can run billion circles around them. And yet, he has to write this fucking book. He's still in exile. So, yeah. So what did his words really matter? What did his ability to speak like in that way really matter in terms of that, right? In terms of that. In terms of whether he can measure success or failure. And what I get from this is what I was kind of feeling before, which is that maybe the success or failure cannot really be measured. The measurement of the success or failure is not really a metric that we should be going on. Maybe success or failure is a binary caught in the same sort of thing. That's what I would have told him if he told this to me. Because I've heard people like that I love say this sort of stuff before, and that's what I would say. That's what I feel every time, like a Palestinian saying something like this to me. That's what I feel. Beginnings have to be made for each project in such a way as to enable what follows from them. Nowhere in my experience has the difficulty of this lesson been more consciously lived, with what success or failure I cannot really say, than in this study of Orientalism. The idea of beginning, indeed the act of beginning, necessarily involves an act of delimitation by which something is cut out of a great mass of material. I didn't remember that he had this in here, to be honest. But the idea of beginning, indeed, so that's crazy. Like, I literally did not remember that he had this in here. indeed, the act of beginning necessarily involves an act of delimitation by which something is cut out of a great mass of material, separated from the mass, and made to stand for, read, represent, as well as be a starting point, a beginning, for the students of texts. For the students of texts, one such notion of inaugural delimitation is Louis Althusser's idea of the problematic, a specific determinate unity of a text or group of texts which is something given rise to by analysis. I'm just going to look at that citation, that footnote. From Louis Althusser for Marx. Yet in the case of Orientalism, as opposed to the case of Marx's texts, which is what Althusser studies, there is not simply the problem of finding a point of departure or problematic, but also the question of designating which texts, authors, and periods are the ones best suited for study. And what does that mean? Why is it fundamentally different? I guess it's something that we can think about, and I hope everyone has enjoyed, and that we can come back. I'll be talking about this tomorrow, and I'll be talking about it tomorrow probably at 4. I'll be going from 4 to 9 tomorrow probably, and I'm really excited to keep going. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. For folks who are tuning in, I hope you enjoyed it today. Of course, I'm just ending a little bit early today, 3.5 hours, because I want to watch this UFC fight tonight. I'm really excited. So I'm gonna get ready for that, answer some student emails, and kick it. And like usual, for anyone who hasn't followed, who's watching, please follow. For anyone who thinks someone that you know would like this, please feel free to share with them. Tell them to follow. To be honest, I've started realizing as I've been doing this that this is not that fun for me if I don't have people kind of engaging with me. And that's not to say that anything except for just that, like, it's not to put pressure on anyone. I'm just like, so for me, like I said at the beginning, I'll just do this for a few months. I'll do it every day, and whatever happens by the end happens by the end. You know what I mean? If there's enough people following, so that there's sort of regular engagement, like there was today. Like Azem made the whole day. You know, like it was like a great day for me, and I feel like the way that we were thinking about this was about 50 times better and more productive and more interesting and more beautiful because you were here. And that's not to say like putting pressure on you to be here. I'd never expect that, but I'm just saying like usually there are different people in the chat every day actually, so it's kind of normal. That's just how it works with any streamer. You know what I mean? So that's to say that I think one of my metrics for whether I continue this after a few months is just to see if there's enough people so that even though it's not realistic for people to tune in all the time, there's enough people so that there's usually someone there tuning in, you know? And so that's to say, yeah, please share it with anyone you would like, who you think would like this. Tell them to follow, so that basically the follow is really so they can get notified when I come on, because I do come on at different times every day. And feel free to share from whatever platforms you have. I can't take my Twitter off private for some personal reasons. I haven't been able to in like a year and a half, really. So I can't really share it in that way. So any sort of sharing would go a long way. And I saw that someone did at the beginning of my stream today, and that was so awesome. It was so beautiful, and I appreciated it so much. And it's beautiful just in the sense that, I don't know, it's fun to just do this together, you know? So yeah, that's all I was going to say. Just my plug, you know, the plug that I have to do at the end of the stream. And other than that, have a great Saturday, y'all. Bye.